Good morning, everyone. My name is Troy Dumoulin. I'm Vice President of Research and Development at Pink Elephant, and I'll be your speaker for this morning's webinar. And we'll be speaking on the subject of DevOps 15 essential practices, and we're going to throw in an assessment tool as well. Folks, the session we're going to be doing today is going to be looking at a specific way to look at a holistic approach to DevOps. Often what you often focus on or hear talked about is the automation aspect of DevOps, and that certainly is a part of the story. But interesting to note, if you are following any of the DevOps literature, whether those be the books like the Phoenix Project or the DevOps Handbook, or articles such as the Puppet Labs articles, almost always you'll start to hear about and understand that the real challenges to DevOps success really rely in the critical success factors of culture, of leadership, on the more softer side. And if we can get the structure and the practices automated, that's even better. But we have to understand that the critical success factors, in fact, I'll even say at this point, prerequisites to adopting automation strategies that allow us to improve flow, really means that we have to focus on the full stack of DevOps. And that's kind of the metaphor we're going to be using in this session today, is this full stack metaphor, the full picture, the holistic picture of DevOps. And that's one of the things that makes the Pink Elephant course unique in the industry. And I've taken, and actually I've also taught different DevOps courses from different providers. And one of the things I always saw lacking was this more holistic and more wider perspective that we're going to be presenting here. Now, while we're going to be looking at the full stack of culture, practices, and automation, as you can see, the kind of deeper dive in this session will be on the practices aspect. But I can't speak just about the practices and give the holistic approach, so we'll provide the larger context before we jump into the details. All right. So, it's no secret the fact that we're always evolving. The industry is always trying to catch up to the most recent technology disruption. And in essence, we hear a lot in the webinars and the conference space about digital transformation. And the way I like to think about digital transformation is how cloud-based technologies, hybrid cloud strategies have allowed organizations to become market leaders without ever having to build or invest in their own technologies. In fact, you can have a brand that you've never heard of before enter a market, lease, literally rent the entire IT stack, and be able to sell products and services without any of the traditional investment you'd have to make in a data center or network operations center, etc., because that's out there now in the digital technologies available on the cloud. Not saying that that's the way all organizations should go, but that has definitely changed the game. Because if I was to think about digital transformation, I would call it digital competition, because that's what we're up against. And so speed to market is one of the challenges we see driving this now almost laser focus on increasing velocity and flow of organizational value creation. The challenge with that, though, is that many organizations, even though they have access to the automation and they have access to the literature, because we can reference various sources of knowledge and bodies of knowledge, whether that be Agile, Scrum, or service management concepts, or getting into architecture, security, the challenge doesn't seem necessarily to be a lack of knowledge nor a lack of tools, because both are readily available. As long as you can, provide the funding, you can buy the knowledge, you can buy the tools. Our challenge seems to be the organizational inability to proceed at speed, and largely because of the challenges that you see on the screen. So we work with many organizations, and this is constantly the same issues that we see coming back. There's challenges with the engagement from a customer perspective. There's unclear channels for demand capture. And that being said, what happens is requirements generation and understanding demand is very complex, because demand is entering the organization in all different forms. And that also then comes to the challenge of prioritizing value delivery. It takes a village, literally, to kind of create value in an overall value chain. Various organizational groups working on development, operations, architecture, security, network. But all of those organizations have different ways of doing things. They have different values. They prioritize work differently. And this creates a huge issue in scale and as well as speed. One of the principles behind the DevOps movement, because it has its genesis in the Lean movement, which is in many ways a founding concept behind both Agile and DevOps, is that for an organization to gain velocity and speed over time, all the agents and stakeholders of that system would need to share values, beliefs, and the basis of how to establish priority. Because if not, as you can imagine, what happens as each organization tries to pick up speed, right, in different directions, we actually can detrimentally impact organizational velocity. And by the way, velocity is defined by speed with direction. It's not just going fast, it's going fast in a common direction. So this prioritization of value hits us in the speed aspect, so we see that as a cause and effect. And one of the things also that comes out of not having shared values, beliefs, and practices is what we'll call variability. It's a lean concept, meaning simply that when you have many different silos doing things many different ways, we create variability, which creates complexity, as you see on the screen, which of course creates costs, because if I'm going to do anything in the organization 3 different ways, I'm going to pay the cost of doing it 3 different ways. And then if I have to integrate them through some kind of integrated API system, I have to manage that integration, again, raising cost. Much of this all comes out of the fact that we have issues with collaborations, and it all has its genesis in the fact that we exist in silos, right? We have a real cultural challenge to look and understand the IT value system as one system. Every group wants to hold on to its own unique belief system, if you will, which creates chaos in the context of getting speed. Well, that's a problem, because when I think about what is value, which is a key concept in many of the frameworks we discuss, right? Value is definitely a discussion of DevOps, because the whole premise of DevOps is how do I go from requirements to value as quickly as possible. But value isn't just about speed. I have to hit 3 primary dimensions, and this comes from the lean background, as I mentioned. And so for a lot of years, many of the frameworks would only focus on quality. And quality, in one aspect, is important because it delivers the feature or the function that you expect. So there's a functional aspect of quality. There's also a non-functional aspect of quality, because it not only has to be fit for purpose, it does what it needs to do, it should also be fit for use, including non-functional requirements for security, compliance, regulatory, disaster recovery, availability, resilience, all of the things that you would expect in a architecture, the ability to support and get rapid production support in the need for service restoration. All of those aspects come to the quality conversation. But the challenge with that is if we have quality, but our speed, of course, isn't getting us to be competitive with our alternatives that are out there, whether those are built on the web unicorn organizations or they're brick and mortar organizations which are adopting these practices of automation faster than other organizations, we begin to be at a loss competitively. And of course, if we're wonderfully it's going at speed and quality is not an issue, but our service costs 4 times as much, we can't compete. So in essence, it all goes back to this fact that we have to be able to balance all 3 of these dimensions and deliver on all 3, because here's what is driving this whole desire for gaining organizational velocity. It's a pure economic model. And this is the same economic model that has always driven organizations to find leaner and more optimized ways of delivering service. And what you're seeing on the screen here is a simple demand and supply curve, where the pink represents the rate of demand you get from your customers, and the green represents your ability to supply as a service provider. So at one point in our history as an IT industry, our rate of supply was faster than our rate of demand. So those were the good days, right? That's when we had leisure time to think about innovation and focus on continual improvement. But as we see the disruptive technologies now putting organizations at risk, and where organizations, if they're not able to adapt these disruptive technologies like Blockbuster compared to Netflix, right? What we see is now this desperation for organizations to go faster speed to market. So this disruptive technology curve, as you can see, takes a rapid increase in demand. So the rate of demand goes through the roof. However, we at the IT service delivery capability have hit a roof or a ceiling in our ability to scale. And this is a problem, largely because of the silo mentality, the complexity, the difference of values and beliefs, technical debt. You can you can pick a number of different reasons, but we've literally hit an inability to scale. Now, for a while, we compensated by doing the heroics. We gave up our evenings, we've given up our weekends, and that's why most people will do their email at 10 o'clock at night and why they're on call on the weekends. But the interesting thing is, the one thing you can't make more of is time. So there has to be a better way, a smarter way to collaborate, to do things as a team versus different silos or tribes, if you will. And so this is the theme of DevOps. They're recognizing that for the organization to gain velocity, they're going to find a way to work together more collaboratively, not as different silos or tribes, but as more of a we the people and as a system approach. In fact, the whole principle of DevOps, the very name of DevOps, comes from this blending of two different families, if you will. I have the people who do plan, and they do build, and they do QA, and they test. Then I have people on this other side doing operations and delivery and support. And of course, we know that even within those two silos, we can then fragment even more. But in essence, all organizations have traditionally had these two very discrete structures. Even more complicated if your organization has two different vertical structures where there's no overarching CIO or leadership structure that is designed in principle to bring them together as a shared belief system. In fact, we often talk about enterprise IT, and by that, what we're meaning is that we have an enterprise or systemic approach to value deliver as an IT services organization. But in my personal and professional experience over 20 plus years of working in the industry, enterprise IT is a myth. Because what we have is operations strategy over there, and we have dev strategy by application or grouping of applications times X. And so there is no sense of planning on a systemic or we basis. So this was the very nature that was discussed at the beginning of the DevOps movement in 2013. This is way before continuous delivery and integration and automated tool chains. DevOps began as a cultural movement to say, why can't we just work together as one system of value? And so in essence, blending these two separate tribes or families together, and by the very name of combining DevOps with no space, we're literally seeing a blended family, to use a metaphor. Now, living in a blended family is a challenge, but it's better than trying to live separate and distinct. So the concept here, we think about this, is that culture is a key component of this. And so this represents the full stack. And this is where we begin to kind of express the larger metaphor of this holistic approach to DevOps. Now, arguably, automation is an interesting thing to talk about. We're in IT. Why not? We love tools. And that's awesome. We need automation. But how many times in your professional career have you had this desire to change behavior, practice, and culture and say, well, we're not going to deal with all that. We'll just implement the tool, and suddenly the world will be different, and people will do different things and believe different things. Now, you probably have tried this at least once, if not multiple times. I want you to ask yourself how many times by running straight to the tool without getting cultural agreement to actually agree, and then shared practice, that you've actually seen behavior and culture change by implementing a tool. Now, if you're honest with yourself, you probably have seen it fail multiple times. So you just can't go out there and implement a continuous delivery pipeline or tool chain and expect, unless you have got the prerequisite of culture in place, even to agree that we should agree to agree, right? And then what are we agreeing on? Well, it's a specific practice around continuous integration or testing or quality assurance or move to production, right? And then if we can agree that that's the practice we're actually going to follow, then awesome, now we can automate it. But this culture practices dimension are these critical success factors that we have seen reported over and over again in article and different aspects of DevOps literature. But of course, we run right to the tool. So this discussion is to say, if you're going to truly be successful at a DevOps transformation, you have to look at it more systemically and from the bottom up, because that forms the basis or the foundation to get to that space we want to be at, which is an automated tool chain. So when we think about culture, culture comes in a couple of different ways, and we'll talk about this a little bit before we get into the practices. And so the DevOps movement talks about culture quite a bit, and one of the cultural models that it focuses on is the model from Westrom, which describes how organizations deal with problems. Because a major part of a DevOps movement is to becoming a learning organization. Through feedback loops and through adjustment, we get better and faster, and we get higher velocity and improve flow. But that's only if we learn from our mistakes. And to learn from our mistakes, we first have to acknowledge we have them. And that's not always easy for certain cultures, because Westrom in his model describes 3 different cultures that deal with problems 3 different ways. So starting on the far left, we have the pathological culture. And the way the pathological culture deals with the problem is that someone must pay. You have a major outage, a major incident that goes down, and you have 200 people get on call bridges into war rooms, and you're swarming the major incident. And then as soon as it's restored, people start looking around who was to blame, and people start pointing fingers at each other, because they don't want to be the one to blame. Because in this culture, the one who created or caused the problem will suffer. Right? Hangings will begin in the morning, if you will, and beatings will continue until morale improves. This is a pathological culture. So what do we do in a pathological culture when we have problems? We hide them. We don't learn from them. We avoid even acknowledging that they exist. The bureaucratic culture is a little bit better, but it's not that much better. They don't, beat people for getting things wrong. What they do is they say, okay, well, fine, something happened that wasn't pleasant. We're not going to want to live through that again. So here's what we're going to do. Let's form a board of inquiry, and let's pull together all the organizational impact statements, and we're going to see what caused this issue. And to ensure we never get close to this again, we're going to add 20 more controls to make sure that risk compliance and audit will, wave their big stick anytime you ever get close to it. So meanwhile, of course, we're not going to expose problems, because by exposing problems in a bureaucratic culture, we just get more non-value-added work to do, and we barely have time to do the value-added work we're trying to get done today. The generative culture, though, is a completely different scenario. It doesn't like problems any more than any other culture, but it meets those problems squarely in the eye. It doesn't try to assassinate the people who identify that there are problems. But we learn from these cultures or problems. We get stronger, and this is the principle of anti-fragility. We grow in our muscles and our strength through the chaos to become stronger over time. And anti-fragility, as you might know, is a major theme we're going to see in the 15 practices that we're going to explore here. Now, the last thing I'll say about culture, because we're going to get on to the practices, is culture comes in the aspect of teams. So a major structural mitigation that the DevOps community has adopted, and this has come again from the Lean community, is the creation of a multidisciplinary cross-functional team. And the Toyota production system has a product line for, let's say, the Toyota Tundra or the Camry or whatever model that you might be aware of in your market. And there's one product owner for the entire line, and that line is made up of specialists, obviously, from different parts of the assembly line, but they work as one team. And so this concept of cross-functional, multidisciplinary teams is a way to break down silos by creating an identity around a shared outcome, in this case, a product. And so the DevOps structural use of this cross-functional team says, well, right now we've got this anti-pattern, where I have dev on one side of the wall and ops on the other side. So we need to do something about that. The first step of a DevOps team is to create this multidisciplinary team. It's called a cross-functional. Now, just think about this for a moment. It's not that we're not familiar with cross-functional teams, this is how we do projects. When we do a project, we pull together from different disciplines, quality assurance, testing, development, architecture, security, operations, production support, the right stakeholders to, fast track an initiative through the full value chain. Well, what a cross-functional team is on a DevOps basis, not an Agile team, which is just development, but a total multidisciplinary team. And the difference being that there's no project, it doesn't go away. This is a semi-permanent team that focuses on the product as a whole. Now, the third and final stage, and again, this is something that we can get into more detail if you take the DevOps Essentials in the leadership course specifically, is how do we then extend that cross-functional team into product and platform teams, where we have platform as a service, which is a lot of times where you might see site reliability engineering or continuous delivery tool chains being generated from. And this product team, this application-oriented team, is connecting through self-help and kind of an Amazonist type approach to request and provisioning. These are the aspects of culture. Now, the webinar that we focused on is looking at the practices. So these are the 15 critical practices, the essential practices that we talk about in our course. To be frank and to be totally transparent, these are not the totality or the total list of practices that an organization would need to think about, but they are a critical starter set, a place to start. And you'll note that the practices, as you see them here, are a list of practices from different bodies of knowledge. Some come from the Lean community, some come from the ITIL service management community, some come from Agile, some come from continuous delivery. So the concepts here is that there's different aspects of the value chain that have to come into play to take demand and to go all the way through the value chain until I'm delivering that product into production and delivering value to my customer. So this 15 essential, think of them as the starter set for any organization if you want to get mature in your practices. Now, obviously, in a webinar, I don't have time to go through all 15, so let me unpack just a few of these to kind of give you a sense of why they're important and how they're used in a context of DevOps. So if DevOps is looking at identifying how do you go from requirements to value, then we're going to have to leverage some of the Lean principles around value creation, because the first starting place of value is to define what value is for your stakeholders. And if you're familiar with Lean, you know that not all work is value added. Some work is value added work, some is necessary but non-value adding, and some is pure waste. And so to improve flow, we have to optimize our value streams, which means I have to map my value stream to know what are the steps that I'm taking to deliver value. And I don't want to automate a non-optimized value stream, so I want to map that value stream, and we'll see that come up as a methodology we're going to leverage in the DevOps movement. To do what? To create flow, to improve velocity. So that's the third aspect or principle of Lean thinking. We're looking at things which are killing flows, like bottlenecks or rework or excessive wait states between steps. Initiate pull says, well, we have too much work in any given day to do all of the work, so I have to create a prioritization model that says, what will I pull into my sprint, we'll use that concept here, based on a prioritization model which is externally driven, outside in, not inside out. So backlog grooming comes from this principle of initiating the prioritization of work based on pulling the definition of value from our customer voice, which is the next conversation. And we're never done. So in Lean, we believe about continual improvement as a key principle, which is a feedback loop, if you will. We're constantly going into this learning organization, which brings us back to the generative culture of Ron Westrom's model. We constantly are looking for ways to improve velocity. So in this principle of Lean, we think about voice of customer. And so this right there gets into the conversation of requirements generation, one of the challenges we talked about earlier. Because in Lean, we think about not just who is my customer and what do they value, but voice of customer analysis would look at customer segmentation. Not all customers are equal in respect to mission. So if I'm going to get customer input, voice of customer input, I'm going to have to understand my customers relative to priority. I'm going to have to think about what is critical to quality. This is a principle of lean thinking, because if I can define something that is critical for the customer value proposition, I then also have to translate my critical to quality into a specific performance measure, which allows me to measure whether I'm delivering value. So if you say, well, I like eating pizza, and most of us probably do, right? And one of the things which is critical for me to enjoy my pizza is that it's delivered to my home quickly, right? Well, I have to define what quickly means. So I might have to say, well, I expect once I place the order on my online application, the pizza arrives at my home no less than 30 minutes, right? So this expresses the definition of value, speed in this case, down to a specific measurable performance attribute, because I have to be able to measure whether I am delivering value. And this is voice of customer analysis and critical to quality measurement. A key practice, if you're going to define value, you have to measure it. Now, there's never going to be a place where we don't have something to improve. So one of the methods that the Agile and the DevOps community pick up on for improvement is Kaizen initiative. In essence, these are short, rapid bursts of improvement, pulling together a cross-functional team for the purposes of solving a specific problem for what? To improve flow, to improve velocity. And a major component of improving flow and velocity is to do this value stream mapping, which is one of the practices that you saw listed on that total list of 15. Because naturally we focus only on the activity, the process step, if you will. And we very rarely ever measure the end-to-end throughput of the total time it takes for the request to hit the backlog to it actually comes out the other end and it's now in production being used and providing value. Well, if you have any exposure to lean, that you'll know that the total time to understand is not just the active time you see in the process time step here, but also includes the time that the step isn't, or the work item, the user story isn't being currently worked on, and we call that wait time. Now imagine a process like a new employee onboarding process, or a server build process, or a testing process. Think about the total time to go in and out, and imagine what the majority of that time is actually made up of. Is it work actively happening, or is a lot of the time actually in wait, where nothing is happening, it's waiting to be worked on because it's next in line, or it's 5, 10 things down the line? So we have to be able to look at optimizing our value streams, not just by optimizing the active steps, by identifying wait time and starting to minimize and remove them. We start to get an improvement, which Lean would call improving the total lead time. And total lead time is this customer measure of value representation. How long does it take to go in the front door, all the way through, and now it's in your hands? And that's inclusive of not just the process or active time, but also those wait time elements between it. And most of the organizations, because back to this whole prioritization, struggle with wait time as majority, because step 2, you might pass the work down to step 3, and for you, that work is critical. But step 3, as we talked about earlier, has a completely different sense of priority. So what is urgent for step 2 is like, well, I can handle that next week for step 3. And so this concept of wait time is critical, and we can't see wait time until we do what's called value stream mapping and start to identify the actual time of not just action time or active time, but the total types of time in my total value stream map. Another key principle that the DevOps movement has picked up is the concept of Agile. And Agile is built on, specifically Agile Scrum as a methodology for Agile, is built on what are called the 3 pillars: transparency, inspection, and adaptation. And the principle of Agile, just to use the concept in English language, is the fact that if I can be making things transparent, well, that allows me to understand what I see and to inspect it. And if I can expect it, then if I need to, I can adapt. And so these are called learning or feedback loops. And the principle of Agile is to constantly be asking yourself, Do I need to continue moving in the same direction, or do I need to pivot and go a different direction? And so one of the things that we do in Agile Scrum, as we'll see, is that we have a maximum duration for any sprint that sets a maximum boundary on the question of, do I take a step forward or do I change direction? And so this concept of creating transparency, inspection, adaptation is a critical aspect of learning and the ability to be able to pivot as necessary. As we look at the Agile Scrum process, right, we see this principle of the three pillars applying in multiple spots. So starting on the far left, we have the backlog, and the product owner in an Agile context is constantly grooming and reprioritizing that backlog, because work is hitting it every day, and not just feature or plan work, but we have defect work. We might have risk and compliance work, architectural or debt reduction work. And so this backlog is constantly being creating transparency, allowing me to inspect and to adapt. So we have all three of these things happening in the backlog on a daily basis. At the beginning of a sprint, we pull off the top of that backlog the work we're going to complete in this specific iteration, whether it's 1 to 4 weeks maximum. And so as we move into the sprint after sprint planning, we have daily stand-up or scrum meetings. And every day we're asking the question, okay, here's what I did yesterday, here's what I plan to do today, and here are the things which are blocking me. And so in the principle of Agile Scrum, every day I'm going through this feedback loop of inspection, of a transparency, inspection, adaptation. Now get to the end of a sprint, and one of the key principles and rules of Agile Scrum is that before I can go back and start another sprint, I have to do 2 additional learning loops. I have to have a sprint review with the customers which have requested the features were presented in the user stories. And so transparency, inspection, adaptation. Before I go back and start, I have a team retrospective where I look at what went well, what didn't go well from the last 1 to 4 weeks. Transparency, inspection, adaptation. So what Agile Scrum is doing is it's creating a discipline in multiple phases to constantly be asking ourselves, is there something we need to do different? Is there something we need to learn? So Agile is a critical aspect of creating higher velocity. And studies show that teams which apply this concept of continual improvement, right, which is based on the principle of perfection of the lean concept, they simply gain higher velocity every sprint because they get better, because they focus on continual improvement and learning all the way through this structure. So this is one of the 15 essential practices of DevOps. Now, we move to continuous delivery and continuous integration. Now, it's quite interesting, actually, because when you ask the average person what is DevOps, they'll say, well, it's about tool chain, it's about automation. And again, yes, automation is critical. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But continuous delivery and continuous integration are their own concepts. They have their own books, they have their own authors, and it's something that many people don't realize about DevOps that is different than all other frameworks or approaches, is that when we think about Agile or continuous delivery or ITIL or TOGAF, or COBIT, these are specific bodies of knowledge which focus on specific things, specific organizational capabilities to create value. DevOps isn't like any of those. DevOps isn't one specific thing. It is a collection of multiple practices that the community of DevOps says, well, that would also work. We should adopt that. And also, let's pick that. And so things like anti-fragility and design thinking, which are things that have been around for decades and other books have been written about them, the DevOps community now embraces and pulls that into the community. So that's a key principle to understand, is that continuous delivery is its own thing, and it actually wasn't the original or the earliest thing the DevOps community adopted, but it certainly is the most popular because this is where we get into the automation. But before it becomes an automation, continuous delivery is really software development. Now, of course, we can have a tool chain or a pipeline supporting the continuous delivery set of process steps. But those of you who've been around the industry, this is a reality. It's called software development. And if you want to call it continuous delivery as a trendy new word, that's fine. And the concept of continuous integration is we have daily code commits versus we do large branching abstractions, and then reinterpret our code at some point in the future, which creates improved velocity and flow. Now, why I'm bringing up this concept of continuous delivery, where I develop something, I commit it to production, I build, I test what I've built, I provision an environment, now I deploy my software to that environment, and then I finally release it to customer, which means to make it available. It becomes a process step first, but then we'll automate it. So before we automate it and talk about the tool chain, though, of continuous delivery, let's talk about just the practices of transition into production. So if we look at the green box in the middle, we'll start there. So as I mentioned earlier, continuous delivery is just another way to say software development and management, which, by the way, is one of the practices of ITIL 4. So when your son or daughter comes home and says, "Dad, it's no longer cool, it's sick," right? All right, we'll just go with it, because that's the trendy new word, but it's software development. But for software development to be successful in its build and promote to production, there are a number of other practices that I have to get right. I have to do release planning. My product owner sits down with my customer base and looks at the cadence and the sequence and the priorities that the business requires, and does release planning for major timelines. Then we enter into the process of development, and part of the test automation is to create testing requirements. And so service validation and testing as an ITIL practice would say, okay, validation means what are the production readiness criteria, both functional criteria like feature and non-functional criteria like compliance, auditory, and risk, right? And now that I have both functional and non-functional requirements, which, by the way, I will capture in my definition of done and my user story success criteria, I am going to then create testing scripts and possibly automated testing to support that. So to support the test automation step of continuous delivery, you need a practice called service validation and testing to establish production readiness criteria. Change control. We still need to continue to think about what is the correct authorizing body to authorize a specific change. It doesn't have to be a physical or manual authorization. Sometimes it can be automated through, regulatory or compliance checks with standard scripts and automation. It can be the product team or the product owner. It could be the change advisory board. This will really depend on the risk and complexity of the change. But the thing is, all organizations do have to decide which is the appropriate change authority for specific types of changes, and how do I move more of those changes into standard pre-approved. Then on the other side of that move to production, I need to think about deployment decoupled from release, which is a change in ITIL 4, by the way, because I can deploy many, many times through feature toggles and abstraction layers. I can deploy hundreds of times to production without actually making it visible to my customer. So to deploy is an IT decision. To make it available, which is available for use, which is to release it, is a customer or business decision, which comes back to the release planning on the far left side. Meanwhile, as we're moving code to the right under these practices, which we're going to automate in the tool chain in the next part of our discussion, right, we're capturing information about this because we can't simply deploy 1,000 instances of a cloud object without capturing now the asset liability, the regulatory and the license requirements for it. And I want to know what the service model is for this as well. So I have to capture this work in my asset and service configuration management practices. So if these practices are working well, then we have a smooth transition into production. If they're not working well, you're going to have a really bad Monday morning, right? So these all work together as a set of practices to connect and deliver value. Now, the other side of this is we have to think about the fact that most teams don't have the luxury of just doing planned work. The same team which does the planned work from our backlog, right, also has to often deal with the challenges of unplanned work, whether that's coming from incident management or technical debt. And a DevOps team, that's another key concept here, is a DevOps team doesn't just build stuff, they also support. So the principle being that if you bake it, you also eat it. If that's the case, then gaining an insight into the amount of unplanned work hitting your team capacity will be a critical success factor for you to be able to know what is killing your flow and dragging you down in respect to speed and velocity. Because if you're not looking at this transparency, inspection, adaptation, then literally it's eating your lunch, metaphorically. This is where we come into the principle of a Kanban board, right? Because Scrum is great for planned work. The backlog is usually planned, value-added, or functional work. Maybe there's non-sensitive defects that might be on a backlog as well. But if you have the same team that's doing planned and also unplanned work, then what you're also looking at is to establish a Kanban board where the work that's been pulled forward into the sprint, in the sprint planning, gets into the backlog of the Kanban. So the Kanban backlog isn't the full product backlog. It's a subset, which is the sprint planning. But not only do we have planned work on a Kanban board, but we also want to see the different forms of work a team will actually have to deal with, whether that's incident and problem, compliance and risk work, or architectural work. And so a Kanban board by nature should be able to visualize multiple forms of work. And together these things are actually called Scrumban as a nickname. So this concept of Kanban is another critical practice that we identify. So the principles here of continuous delivery eventually become automated, right? And so we consider this automated concept where we talk about continuous integration, automated building. We have automated testing, whether that's unit testing, integration, regression testing, UAT testing, automated provisioning of environments, and then the deployment of software. So this is where the tool chain comes into play. But remember what we said. First of all, we have to have a cultural agreement that we're actually going to agree on practices, and then we got to have to agree on what the practice is. Eventually, once we agree what the practice is, we can actually then agree what tools we're going to use for it. Now, the principle of an automated tool chain is that they're not point solutions, but each of these automations creates the output, which becomes the input of another tool. So we need to think about this in the context of this isn't point solution, this is an integrated suite of products flowing work from left to right. But the principle of environmental configuration, which is the active verb to configure, now has to be captured back into the concept of what is our configuration management, right? So if you deploy, again, that 150 virtual objects, I now need to understand what the regulatory, the compliance, the financial liability is, the software licensing. I want to see what, it connects to what in my configuration model. So these principles here come together, automation and practice. So I know it's been a whirlwind of kind of different practices in the course. We take a lot more time and think about it in a more holistic premise. But one of the things that we offer in our course as well is an assessment methodology to support continual improvement. So when we think about all of these different practices, we first think about it from a continual improvement perspective where we say, okay, where are we going? What's the vision? What is our current state? That's where we are now. Where do we want to be? That's our target state. So I'm describing a lot of, perfect scenarios. Well, we're not obviously there. So what's the gap? And how do we get there? And then we'll measure. Did we get there? We have to measure and validate that we did something that actually made something happen. And so if you have any kind of experience in using a maturity model, you know that you can express various practices in a scale. And this is based loosely on the CMMI, Carnegie Mellon model, that says, well, I'm talking about release management or change management or, Agile Scrum. I can talk about it in this context. 0, it doesn't exist. In a court of law, you'd be found guiltless for having a practice. Initial means someone's talking about it, but not a lot of headway. Define means you actually have a practice that's being used, but it's not well managed in the sense it's not measured. Capable says I'm measuring it over time, I'm improving it. Optimize, I've got this perfect scenario I'm improving over time. Now, you're probably already sensing that most organizations are more in the initial and define stage, but again, that gives us a current state from which to start planning our next step. So in the Pink Elephant course that we talk about, there's a full assessment model that goes with the course. We talk about each practice, and that we have a question that can then be represented to say, okay, how is my organization, doing this, and how far am I along in this maturity model? So this is some of the reasons why I've been saying that the course that we do around DevOps is very unique. This holistic full stack approach doesn't exist in any other product. So I hope I've picked up your interest in how we approach the DevOps storyline from a more holistic premise. Now, I'm going to be talking a little bit now about some things coming up in the Asian market. And one of the great things that the folks that are on the webinar today, for your participation here, I'll be introducing one of my colleagues in a moment, and they'll be doing a lucky draw. So I'll be turning it over. But just before I do that, let's talk about some of the upcoming concepts that are available to you if you're interested in this. First of all, this whole DevOps course that I've referred to, this DevOps Essential, the full stack approach, we offer in multiple formats. Of course, you have instructor-led face-to-face, whether it's on-site or in a public venue. But we also have this course available in self-paced, if that's your preferred method. As well, these courses are local. So in the Malaysian and the Singapore market, we have dates coming up in the context of coming up very near future in Singapore in August in Kuala Lumpur. So if you're interested in getting more information and getting a more holistic approach, please visit our website and take a look at the availability of these courses that are available to you. Pink Asia 19, our conference we've been doing in Kuala Lumpur every year for many, many years now, is going to be in August 19 to 20, and many of these concepts will be introduced and talked about. We have many organizations that are doing case studies. Now, the thing about our conference in Asia is that it's an integrated service management theme, meaning there'll be sessions on DevOps, on Agile, on ITIL, on how to connect all of the pieces together. So if you're interested in this more holistic story, I would recommend that you would take a look at this and visit us at the Pink Asia event in August. Last piece of housekeeping before I turn it over to my esteemed colleagues is that if you've enjoyed this session, the session is being recorded, and also the slides will be made available to you. So I see a question in the Q&A already about that. Yes, the slides and also the audio recording will be available to you. Very good. I hope you've enjoyed the session, but we're not quite done yet because it's now time to pick our lucky draw. And to help us with that, I'd like to introduce to you two of my trusted colleagues, Carrie Ann Delinas, who is our CRM manager at Pink Elephant, and also Ambika Mohan, our Asia Sales Account Manager. Carrie Ann, Ambika, I'm turning it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much, Troy, for this very informative webinar about DevOps and the 15 essential practices. And thank you to all our attendees today online. We are very excited to offer a free DevOps training to one lucky participant today. And I'd like to introduce Ambika Mohan, who is the Sales Account Manager in our KL office. Ambika will now announce the lucky winner. Ambika, over to you.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining the DevOps session today. And yes, we have the lucky winner, and the winner is Fauzan Norazak from Petronas. Over to you, Carrie Ann. Yeah, thank you, Troy. Congratulations, Fauzan.
Yes, congratulations.
And so how does Fauzan get access to this, ladies?
I will give a call to Fauzan shortly, and we'll guide him accordingly. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you for your help, and that's awesome news. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Roy.
So just before we close off, if you have enjoyed this session, I would invite you to contact me if there's a question that you might have, and I can certainly pass it on to my colleagues in Malaysia and Singapore if that's necessary as well. I have a blog which I've been writing on for many years that covers many of the topics we've looked at today. DevOps is a passion of mine, And you'll see my blog there as well as LinkedIn and Twitter. Of course, in the world of social media, there's many ways to connect. And so appreciate all the attention that you've given us this morning, and we hope you have a wonderful day. Take care, everyone.